If you are an Elementor user and you struggle with design properties like margins, paddings, vertical align, horizontal align, or maybe you don't even really know what they are or how they function, this video is going to be perfect for you because coming up, I'm going to walk you through what they are and how best to make use of them. Well, hello there, welcome back to the Web Monkey Show. I am Alex. I hope you're doing well and staying safe wherever you are. So like I said in the intro, if you work with Elementor and you've seen these kinds of properties before, position, absolute, vertical align, margins, paddings, and you don't really know what they are or how best to make use of them, this video is going to clear up all the confusion. But let me just first of all say that if this is the first time you're coming across my channel, I'm Alex, welcome. I hope you will give me a subscription. I do upload tutorials on WordPress and web development on a consistent basis. And if this isn't the first time, if you've been here before and you still haven't subscribed, I do hope that today will be the day that I earn your subscription. So let's get started. And what I have in here are two different pages. I do have the page right here where I have created certain kinds of designs, which we'll try to achieve together. I'm going to walk you through what I did in here. I do have 6 of them. So I have Exhibit A right here, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, Exhibit D, E, and F. And then right here, we do have our blank page where we'll do some of the very rough work. So let's get started. And the first thing I want to talk about here would be sections, columns, and the inner section. What exactly are they? Well, let's start off with sections and columns first. Sections are designed to hold your columns. They both will hold content, but the difference is that sections are kind of like the larger container. They are meant to occupy or contain columns. With columns, you can stack them side by side, but with sections stack up on top of one another. As an example, I could drag the heading element in here, go back to the second section, and then drag the button. Now you can see this is one section, this is another section, but they stack up on top of one another. However, with columns, it's different. I could go in here right now and I could create my 3-column structure, and you can see that the columns don't stack up on top of one another. They are side by side. So that's one major difference between columns and sections. Another major difference is that sections are designed to go full width if you want to. So I could go to my first section in here, go to the content width, and then switch from boxed to full width. Now you can see the content will stretch from the left to the right of your screen. Now, technically with columns, you could also try to achieve that, but by default, they're not designed to function that way. So with that being said, let's move on to Exhibit A. And what I have in here is a pretty interesting feature or interesting design. I do have 3 columns in the first section, and then I have 2 columns beneath them. How exactly did I achieve this? Well, one of the easiest things you could do would just be to simply go to your very first section, and you could create your 3 columns, go to the second section, and then simply create your 2 columns, and then add your images in them. Very, very straightforward, right? However, note that here I am using just one single section. Not 2 sections, but one single section. How did I achieve this? Keeping in mind that with columns don't stack up on top of one another. So how was I able to get 3 columns in the first row and then 2 columns in the second row? This is where inner sections come into play. With inner sections, it's kind of like the best of both worlds. You're able to create columns while also being able to stack them on top of one another like a section. So what I did here was I simply went ahead in the very first, in fact, it's the only section, but what I did here was to first of all drag the inner section element in here. I have my 2 columns, and then I simply right clicked on one of the columns in here, and then I added the 3rd column for the first row, and then I simply went back and I dragged the inner section element again for a second time, and I dropped it beneath the first inner section. Note, I'm not dropping it. You can't even drop an inner section inside of another inner section. It's not going to work. So I dropped it just beneath the first inner section, and now I have my 2 columns right there. That's exactly what I did to accomplish this particular kind of structure. So hopefully that helps. Let me just walk you through a few more things. You can always change the width of your individual columns. Right now, you will see, I'm going to highlight this, you will see on my screen, you will see this particular symbol. When you see this symbol, that's when you can now click, hold, and then drag either to the left to increase the size of the column, or to, I'm sorry, to the right to increase the size, or to the left to reduce the size of the column that you're active on. So just keep that in mind. You probably already knew that, but I just felt I should remind you about that particular feature. Okay, that's it for sections, columns, and the inner section. Let's now move on to the concept of margins and paddings. What exactly are they and how best to make use of them? I'm going to go ahead first of all and drag the inner section element in here. Let me add an image to the first column, and I'm just going to pick one image at random. Let's choose the not that one. Let's go with this one right here. Let's insert that one. And then I'm going to add the text editor just beneath the first element right there. So I've got my text, I've got an image. And then for the second column, let's just go ahead and add an image in here as well real quick. Let me choose this one. Not that one is a bit too small. Let's go with Cloudways Review. Okay, let's go with that one. And there you go. Okay, so what exactly are margins and paddings? They're designed primarily to create space. Okay? With margins, when you use margins, you're trying to create space between one element and another element. It could be between one column and another column, between a section and another section, and so on. That's what margins do. Right now, if I went to the first column right here, and I clicked in there, and I go to advanced, right here you will have margins and then paddings. Let's talk about margins first. Note that you do have this link values together function active. What this means is that if you add any value to either one of the sides, automatically the same value will be applied to the other boxes. You typically don't want this unless there are certain situations. So let me just go ahead and make this one 0 first of all, and then click on the button to remove that link value function. Now, you can add the margins to either the top, bottom, left, or right. Let's assume that I wanted to create some space between the first column and the second column. There's two ways how I can achieve this, two primary ways how I can achieve this. I can either add margin to the right of the first column or margins to the left of the second column. So I could come in right now, we're active on the first column, and I could say margin right. Let's go ahead now and give this one 30 pixels. Notice now that we now have a lot more space between the first column and the second column, but also notice that as I'm giving this more margins, notice that the contents area is shrinking. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. That's because we're adding, that's because we're adding more space, and as such, the additional space we need to compensate by making the content space smaller. Okay, so I hope you got that. However, let me go back to 0 in here and notice the reverse. We could actually give negative values to our margins. I could come in right now and say, okay, margin right is going to be negative. You're not going to see the effect in here because we're applying it directly on the column. However, if I go to my image itself right now, the actual image itself, I clicked on it right there. I go to advanced, and now let me first of all unlink the values. Now I'm going to apply margin right, and now I'm going to give it a negative value. Do you see what's happening? Right now, the image has broken out of its container. That's another thing margins do. When you apply margins, especially when it's a negative value, it's going to make the element break out of its container. Originally, we had the image perfectly placed inside of its column. But because we're now giving it a negative value, we're saying, hey, break free, fly, get out of your column, get out of your shell. So now that's exactly what it's doing. The image has broken out and now it's now overlapping into the second column. And also notice that because of the negative values, the size, the content area is getting bigger and bigger. The image is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You got that? Let me show you Exhibit B. Right here, we have two columns with two different images, but notice that the column on the right, the one with the sideground image, it's overlapping into the background or into the column of the Cloudways image. You can see that right there. So right now, you should already know that, yes, we used a negative value. Before we get into this, let me first of all quickly cover our paddings, okay? Let me go back in here and give this one 0. So everything is back to normal. Now with paddings, what you're doing with paddings is you're creating space between an element and its border, or between an element and its children elements. As an example, in here, this image, even though you can't see, this image has a border. This text element actually has a border as well. You can see when I hover on it, you can kind of like see the blue, light blue line right there. That's basically the borders. If I wanted to create space between those elements and their borders, I'm going to use paddings. Now, let me click on the text editor element, go to advanced, and now padding. I am going to unlink the values again. Now, if I wanted to create space between the top border, the top of the border of the text editor and the text editor itself, I'm going to go to padding top, and now I'm going to say padding whatever. You can now see there is more space between the top border of the text editor and the text editor itself. That's exactly what paddings do. Paddings create space between an element and its border. Margins create space between elements. It could be sections, columns, you name it. That's the primary difference between margins and paddings. Note, however, that with paddings, you cannot create or give negative values for paddings. It doesn't work that way. Because think about it, okay, paddings are meant to create space between an element and its border. When you give it a negative value, you're basically saying, hey, I don't want any space. So it kind of like negates the whole concept of having paddings in the first place. It just doesn't make any sense. With margins, it's a little bit different, because with margins, not only can you use margins to create space, you can also use margins to force elements to break out of their containers, like we did in the first example, and like what we did over here right now. You can use margins to make sure that an element breaks out of its borders by using the negative values. So keep that in mind. One more thing I want to mention is that with margins and paddings, the values stack up together. As an example, if I go back to my first column and I said margin right, let's go with 25 pixels. If I now go to the second column and I went to advanced, margin, unlink the values, and I said margin left, 25 pixels as well, what you're going to see right now is that the space, the amount of space between the right side of the first column and the left side of the second column is now 50 pixels. 25, 25, 25 plus 25 is 50. So keep that in mind. The values of your paddings, margins, they all add up together. Okay, now let's go back to Exhibit B. What exactly did we do in here? Okay, it's fairly simple. I'm going to go back in here. Let me make this one 0 once again. Go back in here and let's make this guy 0. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and remove the text editor. We don't need that anymore. And I'm going to go ahead now and add the images. So let me go back to content, switch this to Cloudways, insert that one, go in here as well, change this to the sideground image. Okay, so how do we go from here to here? All right, I'm going to go back in here. I'm going to click on the edit button for the sideground image, and we're going to give it a negative value. Okay, and that's going to be negative value from the left. And there you go. Let's just say 60 pixels. I'm not exactly sure the value here, but let's say it's 60 pixels. But then notice that in here, this particular image, the Cloudways image, there is some space from the top and bottom. it's not like what we have in here where the image is exactly at the top. So what did you do in here? Margin top. Good. So I'm going to click on the image, go to advanced, margin unlink the values, and now margin top. Oh, sorry, I actually linked the values. Let me switch that back to 0. Unlink the values. And now margin top, let's go with 20 pixels, or let's just say 25 pixels. Now you can see that. However, do you notice something different? Here, the Cloudways image, it's overlapping the SiteGround image. Do you see that? The blue is in front of the black. However, over here, the black is in front of the blue. How do we achieve that effect? That's where the z-index function comes into play. Check this out. I'm going to go to my SiteGround image, and right here where you have the z-index, I'm going to give this 1. No, let's give it 2. It doesn't really matter. Let's give it 2. Now I'm going to go to my Cloudways image, and where you have z-index, I'm going to give it 3. And there you go. That's it. That's where the z-index function comes into play. Z-index function will determine which image is in front, or which element is in front. So the image or the element with the higher z-index value will be the one in front, while the one with the lower value will be behind. So the z-index is a fantastic function whenever you're trying to overlap elements or sections or columns, and you want one particular column or you want one particular section to be in front. You simply give that element the higher z-index value. Okay, so now let's move on to Exhibit C, where we have a different design. We do have 2 columns, but then notice that we have the image in both columns. It's rounded, but also about a quarter of the image is above the column, while the remaining 3/4 is inside of the column. How did we achieve that? You also notice that we do have the text editor. However, the first letter in here is capital. How do we achieve that? Well, let's go back to our work page in here. I'm going to go ahead and delete this section, add our inner section, go to the very first column, and I'm going to add my image right there. Let's choose the image right there. And then I'm going to go back in here to add my text editor. Let's go ahead and add a background color for the column itself. Style, background type classic, color. Let's go with something reddish, okay? And there you go. Okay, we're going to ignore the second column for now because we don't need it. Let's just focus on the first column. So first things first, here would be the capital L. You probably already know this, but just in case you don't, in your text editor, you have access to this thing called the drop cap feature. You enable that, and what happens is that it will make the first letter in your paragraph to be capital. That's exactly what that is. Very, very simple. Let's move on. Let's now focus on the image. How do we get it to be rounded? This is where border radius is going to come into play. First things first though is I'm going to make the image size to be thumbnail. Very, very important because it's small. So thumbnail size, but now from here, I'm going to go to style, and then right where you have border radius, I'm going to add values. And what it does is that it will make the edges of the elements to be circular. And the more values you provide, the more rounded it's going to be. And right now you can see we have the image right there in a circular design. Now, if you want to add colors to the border, like what I did in here, you can see the border is yellow. You want to choose a border type. Typically, it will be solid. So you want to go with solid, and now you'll have the color option. You go in there and then simply choose a color, and there you go. Okay, awesome. But now, how do we get the image to be a quarter outside of its column while the remaining 3/4 is inside of the column? Think about it. We just talked about it. It's going to be margins, but not just any kind of margin. Negative values for the margin applied where? Left, right, bottom, top, top. You got it. Okay, so let's go back in here. I'm going to go to the image, go to the advanced tab, unlink the values, and I'm going to say margin top minus, I believe it's 50 pixels I gave. And there you go. As simple as that. I'm sorry, 55 pixels actually, 55 pixels. But notice that as we began to apply the negative values to the image, The text editor also kept going up as well. It's like, don't leave me, I want to go with you. But we don't want that. We want the text editor to remain where it's supposed to be while we increase the negative margin top value for the image. So how do we do that? It's very, very simple. Just go to the same image where you apply negative top minus 55 and now give it bottom 55, and there you go. Now it's pushed the text editor back because now it's saying, hey, I want space between me and the text editor, and that's exactly what I did there. Very, very straightforward. From now, I can simply go in here right now, right click on the edit column button, duplicate, and then delete the third column right here. And now I can just change the background color, the image, and so on, and there you go. That's exactly how I was able to achieve this kind of design. Okay, so now let's move on to the next exhibit, and this is going to be exhibit D, where we have a different kind of design. We have two columns, but then notice that we have the background image for each column, but then the text in the first column is at the bottom of the screen, while the text for the second column is kind of like in the middle. How exactly do we achieve this? I'm going to go back in here. Let's remove this section. Let's add our inner section, and I'm going to go to the first column. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the background image for that column. So I'm going to click on the edit column, go to style, go to background type classic, image right here. And I believe it's this image. Let's insert that in there. And then I'll do the exact same thing for the second column as well. Go to style, background type, image, and this one. Okay, now we don't really see anything. What you want to do is you want to give more height to the inner section. So I'm going to go to inner section element, and then right here where you have the height, change default to minimum height, and then let's go with something quite tall. Let's go with 540 pixels. Okay, cool. Now, notice something strange happening. This particular background image seems to be repeating. We'll talk about that a bit later, but very, very quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change what's going on in here. I'm going to go to my size and change that to our cover. Don't worry, I'll explain what exactly I just did later. But here is what we have, and pretty good. Okay, we have the background images for both. Let me do the exact same thing in here as well real quick. Size, cover. Okay, now how do we get the text to be at the bottom of the first column? Let's go back in here, add the heading element, and there you go. Change this one to H5. But by default, whenever you add elements, they will stack up at the top of the column. So how do we get it to go to the bottom of the column? If you're thinking margins or paddings, you're not exactly wrong, but it is not the best way to accomplish this. What you want to do is to apply something known as the vertical align. So you want to go to your column, go to the layout, and then where you have vertical align, change this one to bottom. And there you go. So right now, any elements you add to the column will be positioned from the bottom. That's exactly what that does. You do have other values in here like middle, which you can already see we're going to apply to the second column. And then you also have the default, which is top. But then you also have like space between, space around. What this does is that it will basically create equal space between the element itself or the elements that you have and then the borders. So this is not the best example because I'm only working with one single element. But if I had like 3 headings, for example, or a header and an image and something like that, this is where space between, space evenly, and so on will be useful. Space between will try to create as much equal space between your elements. And then I think space evenly will create equal space between the elements and the actual borders themselves. You can play around with that feature if you want to see how it works. So without wasting any time, let's go real quick to the second column right here, add our header, and then also add the text editor in there. Let's just change this one real quick to the H5, go to the column button, and then go to layout, vertical align, middle, and okay, let me just change this one real quick back to bottom, and there you go. Very, very, very simple, and that's how you can make use of the vertical align. You do have horizontal align, which I'll show you very, very soon. But let's now move on to exhibit E, which looks fairly simple. I mean, you've got two buttons inside of a section side by side. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, not quite. See, if I go back in here, let's remove this. If I go ahead now and add my button, and I want to go ahead now and add another button inside of that section, notice that they kind of like act like columns stacked. They act like sections stacked on top of one another. Right here, I used just one single column. I didn't use the inner section that gives us two columns. This is one single column. But somehow, I was able to get the two buttons to be side by side. See, what happens by default is that whenever you had certain kinds of elements like your header element, text editor, buttons, they act like block level elements. That's a reference to CSS. A block level element is an element that will occupy the full width of its container. It's not going to allow another element to stay by its side. Okay, the opposite of a block level element is what we call an inline element. Inline elements will go side by side, and that's exactly what I did in here. I converted the buttons from a block level element to an inner kind of element. So how exactly did I do that? You want to go over to your first button, go to the advanced tab, and then right here where you have your positioning, you will have width. You want to change this from default to inline. Go to the second button as well and repeat the process. Advanced, go to positioning, width, inline, and there you go. That's exactly how to achieve that. However, one disadvantage of doing the inline thing is that it removes the ability for you to now align your element. With block level elements, you can align them to the left, right, center, but with inline, you cannot do that. If I go back to the button right here, and I went to content, you see the align right now, it no longer works. I can't align to the right, but if I changed it back to position, go back to default, I could go back to content and now align to the left, align to the right if I want to. So how exactly was I able to make these buttons inline, but then also align them at the center? Let me show you real quick. I'm going to go back in here, change this one to inline once again. So what did I do? Horizontal align. I'm going to go to my column, go to horizontal align, and then center. There you go. And of course, if you want to create some space between the buttons, simple, use margins. So you can click on the first button right here, go to advanced, unlink. So we can add margin right, maybe give that like 10 pixels. And there you go. Very, very, very simple. So that's exactly what inline does. You go in there, go to your position, inline, you change that from default to inline, and then you will now have the elements stacked right next to each other. You can do the exact same thing for your headings, for your text editors, and so on. You can also go with the custom, where you'll now choose the actual width of the element itself. So you could also work with that, which brings us to the second option in here, where you have your position, which is position itself, and now you have absolute and fixed. What exactly are these? Let me go ahead now, first of all, and remove that text editor. I'm sorry, that section. Let's add an image in here. And in fact, you know what? Let's go back in here and use the actual workbook in here, okay? So I'm going to go to the Cloudways image, and I'm going to go to position, change this position now to absolute. What this does is that it basically forces the element to break away from its container, and you can position it wherever you want to. So whenever you add elements or content to your page, there's a certain kind of structure they're supposed to follow. It's either they go from left to right or they go on top of one another. That's why by default, you don't see elements stacking up on top of one another or this particular column overlapping into the other column, because there is a structure. There is a process by which these elements are applied on your page. By changing the position to absolute, You're saying, hey, I don't want that. I'm going to position this element at a very specific spot on my page. So I've changed that to position absolute. And now I can change the orientation from left to right, or I could also change the offset. Do you see that right now? I'm changing the horizontal orientation right now from left to right, or the vertical orientation from top to bottom. I could switch that one right now, go right there, and then also maybe move it here. So I can position my elements at very specific spots on my page with absolute. Fixed works the exact same way, except the image or the element is going to be fixed at that particular location. So right now, if I scroll, you can see right now that the image will always be there because it's fixed. If it's absolute, it will scroll along with the page. That's the difference between absolute and fixed. But both of them will allow you to position your element at a very specific spot. Keep in mind, however, that this may not look good on mobile. So make sure that if you're going to work with the absolute position or fixed position, make sure that you test it out on your mobile device and make sure that it actually looks good, or you could simply disable the feature on mobile. But that's exactly how the absolute position works, fixed position, and also changing the width of your elements from a default to inline. Okay, so now let's move on to the very final design, and here we do have a section with a background image, and then we also have a text editor in here. What is the purpose in here? Well, I want to talk to you about background images and how to work with them. See, right now, what's going on here is that I do have this background image. Let me just show you real quick. It's under my style for my section. This is the background image right here. I also have the background overlay that I've applied. It's basically the classic color, black, right there, and that's the opacity level, okay? But you would notice that the background image right now is repeating. You can see right here, this is the first instance, that's the second instance, the third instance, and so on. What's going on in here? Well, if I go back to background, you have different kinds of properties. First things first though is you have the repeat. I'm going to change this to no repeat. And you see what's happening right now is that we have the image right here being displayed, but then it no longer repeats. However, also notice that the background image is not occupying the full width and height of the section. So if you want to change that, you're going to go to size and change this one to cover. But then you also have contain. What is the difference between contain and cover? When you choose the cover option, what you're saying right now is that no matter what, you want the background image to always occupy the full width and height of its section, of its container. Even if it means stretching the image, in this case right now, you will note that the image is stretched. That's because the actual size itself, it's not that big. It's 500 by 500 pixels. It's not the biggest image out there. That's why it's now been stretched to occupy both the full width and height of the section. So if you're gonna go with this option, make sure your image is big enough. Now, with contain, it's the opposite. Now you're saying, no matter what, I want the full image to be displayed. Right now, the priority is displaying the full image. It's not about making the image occupy the full width and height of its container. No, the priority right now is displaying the full image. And that's exactly what you have in here. It may not always work. It works here because the image is 500 pixels by 500 pixels. So we can actually display the image in its full size and in its full length and width. However, if the image was very large, like let's say 2000 by 2500 pixels, and the container was too small to occupy the image, contain will still try to display the image as best as it can. You do have the auto, where basically Elementor will decide how best to display the background image, but typically you want to go with either cover or contain. My advice would be to go with cover, but make sure that the image is big enough. But you also have the repeat function. This is useful if you're using contain. It's not going to work with the cover because regardless, the background image is still occupying the full size of its container, so repeating it is not going to make any sense. But if you switch to contain, what this does right now is that because the initial size of the background image is too small to occupy the full width and height of the container, okay, you can see this is the initial design. What you want to do is you can come in here right now and say repeat, and then repeat either X, which would be for horizontal, or repeat Y, which would be for vertical. In this case right now, it's going to be repeat X because we're repeating from left to right. So that's where you now have it looking like this. So that's exactly what the size and repeat options do. Let me just show you one more thing. Let me switch back to cover. Change one to default. Now you also have position, where you can change the focus of the image. You can go with top right, bottom center, bottom left. You can see right now that it changes the focus from which the background image is being looked on. So you do have that option in here as well, just to kind of decide how best you want to display your image. So this will of course be very, very subjective and will depend on the image as well as its size. You also have the scrolling not the scrolling feature, but the attachment, where you can make it fixed. So basically, if you scroll up or down, the image itself will be fixed in the background while the other elements will move up and down. Or you could go with scroll, where you will now have it scrolling up and down just like any other normal element. But if you even had more elements inside here, where it becomes very, 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 very tall, you will have the scroll bar feature by its side. You can play around with that option. So that's basically how to work with background images. My best advice is, no matter what option you choose in here, whether it's cover, contain, make sure the image is big enough to occupy the full width and height of its container. One thing I forgot to mention was that while we were talking about the border radius, I forgot to mention that with your images, you also, under the advanced tab, in fact with most elements under the advanced tab, you will have another option in here for border. What is the difference between this border and the border that you have under the style tab? Well, the one for the style tab, the border being applied in here is directly on the image. But if you now go to the one on advanced, you go to border, and then let's just add a border type solid. What's going to happen right now is that this border will be for the outer border of the image itself, okay? So right now you can see this is the border, the outer border of the image. So right now, if you apply your border radius, it's going to be applied to the outer border of the image right there. It's not the border that you typically want to work with. It's going to be the one under the style tab in most instances. Well, that's it. We've come to the end of the tutorial, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please do consider giving the video a thumbs up. Do share the video with anyone whom you feel might benefit from it. And let me just also say that whenever you make changes, especially changes involving the position, the vertical align, paddings, and so on, make sure you test them on mobile as well. If it looks good on mobile, awesome. If it doesn't, you can either adjust the values of the margins and so on, or you could just disable the feature on mobile specifically. Also, let me mention that whenever you're adding paddings and margins between your sections, make sure that you are consistent. Don't add 20 pixels of margin between the first and second section, and then add 50 pixels between your third and fourth sections. You want to be consistent whenever you're applying margins or paddings on your website. That's it for the video. I will have my affiliate link for Elementor Pro just in case you haven't gotten yourself Elementor Pro and you want to buy the Pro version of Elementor. I'll have my affiliate link in the description box below. Thank you so much. I'm Alex. Stay safe out there. If you have any questions about anything we covered in here, I'll put them down. I'll do my very best to answer them as quickly as I can. Thank you so much once again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.